Welcome, everyone. My name is Kari Whaley, and I'm joining you from Orlando, Florida in the U.S. It's so great to be with all of you from around the world and spend this 30 minutes with you. So today, this session is going to focus on the heroine's journey, writing strong female characters, and thinking through some configurations about how we could potentially do that as we influence the development of characters in writing phases. So what are we going to do during our time together? We're going to explore the heroine's journey as a framework for writing characters. And then I have some writing exercises so that we can get to work, right? This is the Power of Protagonists Learning Lab. So we're going to put some of our knowledge and our ideas into practice and begin creating some ideas for an actual character. All right. So before I get into the content, I just want to share a little bit about me. So I grew up in Orlando. I have a doctorate from the University of Central Florida in leadership, where after graduating, I became a professor at Full Sail University, which is this really magical university that is grounded in creativity and innovation. And I teach in the graduate programs that include creative writing, game design, entertainment business, and kind of all of those different things. I am also the mom of a middle schooler. And so these days, the game I play most is Star Wars Battlefront. No judgment. I am, entrenched in middle school boy world right now. Also, some of the things that I do at Full Sail are to serve on the leadership, Women's Leadership Initiative Board. And so my work with the Women's Leadership Initiative at Full Sail informs a lot of my approach to storytelling and teaching. And then the last thing I forgot to tell you is during my time teaching at Full Sail, I went back to school and got a second graduate degree, an MFA in creative writing. And so some of the knowledge that I gained from that and experience as a writer are what led me to being passionate about focusing on how we can write characters differently. All right, so this kind of started when I found this book, and I have it in the resources, but it's called The Heroine's Journey, and it's the foundation of this talk. And in the book, Maureen Murdoch, who was a psychologist, was interviewing Joseph Campbell. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, which is a really fantastic framework. And I have used it many times. And it can be a great approach to storytelling. But Murdoch felt like maybe some perspectives might be missing. And so she was interviewing Joseph Campbell in 1981. And Joseph Campbell said in the interview, this is a direct quote from her book, "In the whole mythological tradition, the woman is there. All she has to do is realize that she's the place that people, right, like read men, are trying to get to." And so this isn't to knock Joseph Campbell. I love his work. I think he does great or did great stuff, right? And his work still informs a lot of what we do in storytelling. But the reality kind of is that this framework of the hero's journey that we see was created with a male journey in mind. And like in that creation and laying it out, the woman is like the prize at the end, right? Like, so we see here, she's the place that people are trying to get to, but that doesn't create a lot of room for women to be journeying and adventuring on their own and having their own adventures. And so Murdoch took influence from Joseph Campbell and many different psychology traditions and research, and she developed something called the heroine's journey. All right, so before we jump into it though, I just want to acknowledge some assumptions and limitations to the heroine's journey. So first, the assumption is that journeying is different for non-male identifying people in a patriarchal society, right? So like comparatively to the hero's journey, if you're a male journeying in a patriarchal society, then the systems support you and the systems support you in your journey. And so if you don't identify as a male, maybe you're a woman or a non-binary person or elsewhere on the gender spectrum, then you're working in a society that doesn't support you in the same way that it supports males. So that's one of the assumptions as we go into this. One of the limitations, though, the heroine's journey was originally written in the 90s and published at that time. And so there's some limiting language around gender identity, and a lot of it focuses on kind of our traditional view of womanhood. And since then, there have been like further publications and writings that open that up to be more inclusive of the whole gender spectrum. So in considering those things, let's jump into what the heroine's journey looks like. So you might notice a similar style as you do to the hero's journey, but it's kind of split in that for the first part of the journey, Murdoch argues that women are existing in kind of a masculine patriarchal structure and in some ways dismissing or not embracing and acknowledging their own femininity because they're trying to find success in the way that it's defined patriarchally, right? So like it starts with this split from feminine, like that we see a lot of success models as men. And so women want to achieve success. And so then they kind of split from some of their femininity in order to achieve success in that system and begin identifying with these masculine characteristics in order to achieve what our society says is successful. And a lot of that was determined in male structures. But then she realizes that she is denying this whole part of herself in this journey. And so she begins to embrace femininity and reconcile with the feminine, right? Healing the masculine and creating a positive relationship in herself with both the feminine side and the masculine side, right? Integrating the two together. And then moving forward with that new awareness and knowledge. So this is one framework, and there's a lot to it. Like when I say a lot, there's a whole book. So I gave you the dime store version. I invite you, though, if it's something you're interested in, I have a resource page at the end. I invite you to dive into those resources as you find interest. All right, so how can we look at the heroine's journey for storytelling specifically, right? Because originally this framework was created as kind of a psychological framework, but it has been adapted into how we can create female characters and the ways in which a woman's journey, kind of going against the grain of patriarchy, may be different than the male journey. And so I found this really great infographic. And there are the credits there if you want to look this up or screen grab it and make it bigger. But the idea is that we're starting with the illusion of the perfect world, or the female character is starting with this naivete, right? That she's Cinderella and someone will take care of her. And then there's disappointment. because that's becomes not true, or there's a betrayal of a story that we've heard. And so in that feeling of betrayal and disappointment, the heroine prepares for her own journey, right? So if she's like starting out thinking that she's Cinderella, and then she realizes like, oh shoot, like I'm not Cinderella. Well, maybe I am, but I can still adventure as Cinderella. So she's disappointed. She realizes that what she was told or what she was taught isn't the case. And so she begins to have an awakening and prepares for her own adventure, right? And so in this adventure, she's told that she can't do it, or that she doesn't have the tools to do it. And we see limiting structures, societal structures that tell women, you can do this, you can't do this, and what that might look like. And so she continues to pass through the gates of judgment, right? Maybe she's feeling shame about her identity, or maybe she has a fear of how to fit into society, or a fear to break out of traditional gender norms, and whatever that might be. So she goes into the eye of the storm. She takes a chance. She takes a risk, until, right, we see things get worse. She might have failed. She might be accepting defeat. She accepts support, right? Reconciling maybe the masculine and the feminine at this part in the cycle. And then she has her own rebirth, finding harmony with all of these different pieces. And so we can adapt different pieces of this to the journey, in understanding that, like, with the different societal structures, maybe the heroine's adventure has different obstacles or looks a little bit differently than what we've seen with the hero's journey. And I see Mercedes shared a link in the chat. Thank you so much, Mercedes, for adding that there. All right, so in considering all of that, I just want to point out, this is only one way of approaching storytelling. And the real takeaway that I would give to you, and that I would encourage you to think about, is that this is just one tradition that we can channel in storytelling to rethink archetypes and rethink what adventuring looks like as a framework. And so this framework might not work for your story or for your character, but I hope what it does is to give you a little bit of encouragement that if other frameworks like the hero's journey don't feel resonant, that's because they have limitations. And so we can look outside of those frameworks and begin to look towards alternative frameworks that are also affirming that different people experience different journeys in the society that we live in, right? Like, not all journeys are created in the same way. And, so as an example, even in my own creative writing, looking back to the heroine's journey, I wrote a short script about a character. So a lot of the writing I like to do is inspired by real characters in history. And one of those was a woman named Juana La Loca. She was a queen of Spain. Her parents were really famous, Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand. And as a woman queen, she faced a lot of obstacles in a patriarchal society that wasn't designed for her to be a leader. It wasn't designed for her to hold power. And so she faced obstacles that were very different than a king might have faced in that same role in that time period. And that included being undermined by people who were important to her, her own husband, her own father. And she had to kind of journey through her own adventure as queen. and find a way, even though society had not designed that role for her. Yes, and Mercedes said in the chat, incredibly correctly, Wana La Loca translate to Wana the Crazy. That's true. And the reason that she got that name is because her father, the king, her husband, wanted to undermine her power. And so they launched a kind of PR campaign, if you can call it that, for the historic time period. You can't, there wasn't official PR. But in the way that we could look at it today, a PR campaign that she was crazy in order to undermine her power so that they could take power from her, right? Just reinforcing that the system wasn't created for a woman to hold that kind of power. And so she ran into all of these obstacles as she journeyed through. And so that's a real story. And in my time researching her and writing a script about her, the hero's journey didn't fit, right? It didn't fit because the system didn't support her. And so I was looking for an alternative way to tell her story. And so I found the heroine's journey felt a little bit more like home, a little bit more resonant, because it acknowledged the real systemic challenges that she faced and that she had to overcome that maybe wouldn't have been considered as part of the hero's journey. Right? So these are just differences, different perspectives, different ways of thinking of things. So with all of that, let's take our final time together to think about this more practically. And, you know, as someone who's here, maybe thinking about writing your own characters, how you can use this to influence characters that you're writing. So we can ask ourselves, like, where does the heroine really begin? And there's an amazing creative writer, and she's published. Her name is Dr. Misha Rai. I also have her on the resources page, so you can find her info. She offers many great workshops and has published so many wonderful things with great female protagonists. She says that at the core of a strong female protagonist are two things: denial, which is the meat of the heroine's story, and desire, which we can point to as kind of the start of her story. And so what is denial? Well, if you are a woman or a non-gender conforming person in a patriarchal society, things have been denied to you, or there are limitations for you and the way that your identity is accepted into that society. Okay, so what are those limitations and how has the character been restricted? And then desire is, what does the protagonist want, even though those restrictions or limitations exist? So for our final minutes today, we're going to jump into a writing exercise. We are time bound today, so I'm going to introduce the exercise. I invite you to take a screenshot if you'd like to spend more time with the writing prompts later, when you have more time to kind of write things out. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes with them, just to give everybody a taste and maybe a little bit of a dipping the toe into the story, and we'll see what comes out of it. All right. So in thinking about this idea of denial and desire, here's the first writing exercise that I invite you into. So if you have a piece of paper, or if you have like a Word doc or a Google doc open, I'm old school, so I've always got a little notepad. What I invite you to do is go ahead and take that out. And we're just going to do some free writing. So you don't have to edit it. Write out whatever comes out, and see what comes up. So we're going to be doing a little bit of generative writing here. So imagine your character, right? And so this is all within the framework of writing a strong female character. So you're dreaming her up. So what might she look like? think of and be as specific as possible. So writing these things out, you can edit them as you go along. But what is her age? What is her appearance? Like maybe considering her style of dress, or maybe the way that she does her hair. I will tell you all, I am on my own heroine's journey because I decided to get bangs this week, and that's been a whole thing. So, you know, that appearance would be a part of my heroine's journey. You might want to consider her finances, right? How does she make or have access to money? Because that will influence things like motivation later. So does she receive money, right? Like if she's a teen, and dependent on her family, maybe she receives money from her family, or maybe she works, right? Maybe she's a detective, or maybe she's an artist, or whatever that may be. Try to be specific about what her work might be or how she generates income. Think about whether or not she has a family. Does she have a partner? Does she have a spouse? Does she have children? Does she not have children? Does she live alone? What is her relationship like with her parents? Does she have close connections, like close friends that fill the place of a family? What does that look like for her? What's her geographical location? And then what year or time period is she living in? And then 2 questions to really think about. So once you identify the time period, think about what specific to that time period would be denied to her. So for me, in writing about Juana La Loca, I'm thinking, okay, during this time, this historic time, what would have been denied to women? So not just specifically to the character, but to women in general. And then secondarily, what are the limitations placed on her by society or world or family, right? Or maybe like institutions, educational institutions or religious institutions. What are the limitations that are placed on her? So I'm going to give you all, let's take a minute, which I know is very short to be dreaming up a character, but let's take 1 minute to give everybody a chance to imagine out their character and begin writing these things about the character and what restrictions and limitations that she might face. And as you're writing, please feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat. Or maybe if you're coming up with some limitations and restrictions that she might have experienced, share those with us, because many of them might be universal themes and may help somebody else who's in the session as they're thinking about limitations to their own characters. All right, that is the timer. So please feel free to jot down any ideas or limitations that you might have come up with in the chat. Oh, I love what Brianna wrote, and thank you, Brianna, for sharing with all of us. She said, I really love writing older woman characters. And she's acknowledging that in writing that, there's so much societal pressure for a woman to be forever young. So that's like a really amazing limitation. Well, I mean, that came out wrong. terrible limitation, amazing to acknowledge for writing purposes. So a really great awareness. So in writing a character who's an older woman, she's going to have this limitation. Maybe one of the pressures that she has internalized is the need to feel young. And how does that influence her? So later, as you're developing the plot, and later as you're developing, how she's going to respond to things, that can be this like shame that comes up for her, or that can be a motivator in why she chooses to do things. Carlene, thank you for sharing as well. Carlene says, I've been researching my ancestors, so I'm kind of imagining my grandma on a farm, right? And so then like what limitations might exist even geographically in that as a woman in the 1940s on a farm? What might those be? And then thinking specifically about writing those up. All right, so we've thought about some of the denial. So then let's think now about her desire. So even though she might have these limitations that are societal or family-based or work-based, she still has desires. She still wants things for her life. And so what might she want? And what is her focus? And this is where your plot's going to come in and is going to begin to develop. And so as you're thinking, writing out her wants and her desires, then thinking, what is she willing to fight for? Like, what would she be willing to fight for to get off the farm, or to eventually run her own farm, or whatever that storyline might look like? Like, what is she willing to fight for? What is she willing to sacrifice? Is she willing to sacrifice leaving behind her home? Is she willing to sacrifice, leaving behind someone she cares about, or a job that she loves, in order to pursue this thing that she really wants? And then how far is she willing to go to get what she wants? And then here's this last question that's going to make your character really dynamic and interesting, which is, what moral lines is she willing to cross to get those things, right? Because really dynamic and interesting characters have flaws. And so if you can find kind of her point where she's willing to cross a moral line to break out of these limitations, it's not that she has to, right? Like in your writing, in the story that you create, she doesn't have to cross that line, but like being able to identify it can become a part of the storyline. It can become a part of her internal struggle, right? So let's take 1 minute to write out these wants and what she's willing to fight for and sacrifice for. All right, so we are at the end of our minute for this exercise. So please feel free to jump in the chat and let us know any of these things that might be coming up for you. So what might your female character want, even within the limitations of a society? I thought that Mata had a really interesting comment. He says, I usually write women and non-binary folks who have already surpassed or fought their limitations. this process starts earlier in the person's journey. Thank you so much for sharing that approach with us and giving us other ideas on how we can incorporate these things. And maybe, like in that example, all of those things happen before the story starts. I think in being able to identify them, it can tell us about where our character is going and maybe some of their motivations and why they make some of the decisions that they do. So thank you for sharing that perspective in the chat. All right, so this is just the beginning, just to get you started thinking about how you can create this character and what her real challenges might be so that she feels like an authentic character. But that's not all, right? So what's next as you're writing her? So you're going to end up developing external conflict. And so the external conflict can be another character who represents those societal limitations, right? Maybe it's a boss, or maybe it's a partner who is representing the societal limitations within a relationship. And so the heroine is finding a way to move out of those limitations. Then you're going to write out her own internal conflict. And so this is where some of those, the pre-writing from those exercises comes into place. So as she is dealing with these limitations and reconciling her own desires, what internal conflicts come up, or in what ways is she limiting herself based on the beliefs she has from the society that she grew up in, or the conditioning that she had as part of her early life. And then lastly, just remembering the subtext. So the subtext is where all that rich stuff comes in. So the stuff that you're not saying directly, but the subtext that influences the dialogue and maybe the way the character interacts with other characters throughout the whole storyline. All righty. So just to share with you all, these are the resources that I used to develop this session and the frameworks. So the Heroine's Journey and the Heroine's Journey Workbook, both by Maureen Murdoch. I recommend both of those. They really take the approach from kind of a psychology approach and can be adapted into creative writing and storytelling. I also really like Carolyn Sharp's The Writer's Workbook. She has a lot of great prompts that can help you to develop your character. And then as you're thinking about these subtext pieces and developing conflict, those types of prompts can help you really kind of flesh that out. And then, of course, lastly, Dr. Misha Ray does some amazing teaching in writing strong female characters. I put her website up there so that if you're interested in following up with her work, you can log on and do that. And so with that, we've got just a touch over 5 minutes remaining. Here's my info. If you want to reach out or connect, I would love to connect with you. And also in our remaining minutes together, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. I would be happy to take questions or share with you any thoughts that I might have. I almost said insights. I don't know if they're insights, right? Because like on some level, we create some of these things as we go. So thank you to everyone for joining. Please hang out and feel free to ask questions in the chat. Okay, Mata, thanks so much for the comment. He says, I love the highlight on subtext here. Very useful writing tip I read a few years ago was the best stories have a message. Made me realize that so many game stories lack a message or a meaning. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the important things in writing a heroine specifically is identifying what her message or her purpose is. And I think that comes in the desire phase. So really figuring out like, what is she journeying for? What is the bigger message in her taking this journey or in her having this adventure. So I think that's really great. Oh, Charlie, thanks for the question. Who's my favorite heroine? You know, I have been reading a lot lately about Celtic goddesses. And so they have been kind of consuming my mind and headspace lately, and influencing the way that I write women, thinking about those kind of ancestral stories that might have been told. Okay. Oh, yeah. Sean has a great question in the chat. They say, when designing a new fictional world, there's the opportunity to not have so many societal restrictions on women. Do you think the heroine's journey can still fit into a more open society? I think so, Sean. So I totally agree with you. That's one of the amazing things about world building, is that when you're creating your own world, you don't have to have those restrictions. And so you can really approach storytelling in a different way. So I really love that you pointed that out. What I would say is that it definitely could, but also if you're building a world, maybe it doesn't influence women in limitations, but maybe in this world you think about limitations in general, and the denial and desire piece of how any character would need to journey past those to find the meaning or the message of their life. All right, we have some great comments in the chat. I'm scrolling through just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, Robin has a great comment. I 100% agree, Robin. Game creation could rewrite history in such a fascinating way. It's so true. And so much of my research and my own approach in writing is informed by having a boy child and seeing all of the stories and games and fiction that is marketed to him, and the ways in which like female stories aren't always honored or shared in a dynamic way. And so it's been really interesting for me to kind of see storytelling through his lens, and then think about the way that as a writer that I can write these stories differently, that open a different perspective or approach. Okay, so a question in the chat, Brianna says, I always struggle with wanting to ignore some of society's constraints, especially in fantasy settings. Yeah, that makes total sense. But I also know that often these things tend to pop up in my writing. How do we deal with finding a balance? So I would say that especially if women or non-gender conforming folks are reading your story, like, we've lived these limitations. Like, these limitations are just a part of our experience. And we all individually are journeying past them as well, right? Like, we're journeying through them to find our own success. And so we bring these lived experiences to our experience in your story. And so I think that it's okay to acknowledge those limitations. I think it makes characters more dynamic and relatable when we can see that what I experience in, in a setting, being asked about how are you going to balance motherhood with a full-time job, right? Like that's not just a mundane limitation that women experience. Like, I like to see characters that experience those kinds of things too. All right, so we only have 1 minute remaining in our time together. It's great to see you all. I'm on Instagram at Kari Whaley. I have a website with some of my work on kariwhaley.com, but also you can email me. Oh, I'm on LinkedIn too, under Kari Whaley. You can find me there. It was great to spend this time with you all. Thank you so much to the gals at Women in Games for putting this together and for your support in the chat and in the session. Charlie, Robin, thank you so much. Lauren, great to see all of you. And I look forward to connecting with you all soon.